Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe here with me, my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
Last time we discussed Chronicles of the First Wars of Azeroth, the beginning of the war, and how Guldan and Blackhand face planted against some trolls, which was actually kind of hilarious. So that the war basically began rather realistically, humorously enough. Realistic in that oftentimes it's a question of who's going to make the dumber mistake. In this case, it was Guldan and Blackhand. They were never very bright in some ways. They just had a lot of muscle and fell magic, which maybe down the road I should do a video on the metaphysics behind fell magic. Might be interesting to study the fell. The response from the Kingdom of Stormwind was to dispatch Lothar, and Lothar ended up running into Medivh and Khadgar. Medivh, though, was to start acting a little erratically and disappearing for days on end and being exhausted when he finally returned. In turn, Blackhand began ordering out more and more raiding parties and trying to cause panic in the human population, wiping out entire villages in the Brightwood, Westfall, and Southern Redridge mountain regions, so that basically he was pushing for more and more war. It's obvious from the troll misadventure, he didn't really have a plan. Well, it's Blackhand. Nobody's arguing that he had a lot of brains between his ears. He's just a front man for Guldan. Lane, though, in one of the last Warcraft videos, I kind of went into some of his flaws. He's not a total idiot. His response was, okay, let's give command to someone who's been confronting these orcs and has gotten a little familiar with them. Thus nominates Anduin Lothar the title of King's Champion, highest military rank in the kingdom. Lothar's immediate response was to begin studying the orcs' movements. In particular, he kept an eye out on their mobility, tried to use that against them by setting up ambushes and using Fabian Tactics, which is actually really smart because in an open fight, the orcs are stronger than humans. In some cases, the small units of knights were able to bring down entire raiding parties without too many casualties. However, some of the orcs soon realized what the humans were about and began to try to figure out, okay, how can we respond? Because they honestly had never fought this sort of Fabian strategy because these knights are not bad fighters. They're just using the terrain to their advantage, which is what you're supposed to do. In the meantime, Lane decided to try to call for aid from the other kingdoms in order to shore up support. So he went on the diplomatic front, which is wise. No help was received, though, as the reports were not believed. I know that a lot of people tend to condemn the other kingdoms, but from their point of view, this is a very weird series of messages from a king who was not the match of Barathan, the Adamant. Lane never had the kind of influence that his father had. That said, Lordaeron was considered the most likely nation to help because of religious reasons, because they... On the other hand, you had the Northshire clerics who began to pitch in to help, which is a pretty big deal because these are priests. Obviously, they decided we're kind of supposed to be men of peace, but desperate times call for desperate measures, which I think praise should be given to these clerics. Not all of them would have been bred for war, but the fact that the Northshire Abbey clerics were willing to rush into war. This is the equivalent of all the young men who rushed to volunteer in the Second and First World Wars. This was a very noble, beautiful act on their part.
They were aware that, yes, we're men of peace, but we're not going to be in complete denial that something is going on and that something needs to be done.
Meanwhile, with the orcs, the Frost Wolves arrive in the Alterac Valley. They did so whilst avoiding many other races for the use of calling upon elements for aid. And it's at this time that Thrall is born. We're going to go back over some of these events because they're worth discussing. For the first immediate response to, oh yeah, I totally screwed up. Whoops. Well, might as well go on the offense in other places and go for easier targets on the part of Blackhand. Yeah, fair. It's a little funny, but on the other hand, it's a little dark. I think it does show at least a bit of brain power on his and Gul'dan's part where they realized, okay, we bit off more than we could chew with those demon-worshipping trolls. Let's go for the humans. Let's stick with them, okay? Which, that's what you do in a war. If there's someone too hard to fight, you don't go fight them. Your thoughts?
Well, what else can they do? Yeah, if they can't fight them, sure they don't have the brain power to try and recruit them to their side.
Would the trolls even join them, though?
No, I don't think so.
You might as well try is what you mean.
Yeah, a velvet glove,
But what if they just kill the messenger?
then you don't deal with them.
That might be seen as weakness by some of the Horde.
That's fair.
So maybe Blackhand and Guldan deciding to cut their losses and not even communicate was the best thing.
Taking a step back, avoiding that region, making it look like it's from a position of strength.
I don't know about position of strength. I don't think that they were able to maintain a position of strength. Those initial losses are partly what came back to haunt them, in that they lost face in front of everyone, and everyone knew it was Blackhand and Guldan who failed. I think that the main person who was able to use this was Orgrim Doomhammer. While they were losing, he was winning. So it did come back to haunt them, and long-term wise, it's part of the reason I think that they were dethroned, because in order to be a tribal war chief, you need to constantly win. If you're not winning, you're going to be kicked off the nice chair. That said, what are your thoughts on Lane deciding once he receives a report from Anduin Lothar, all right, you're in charge of the military, and that this is because we've got entire villages being slaughtered.
King Lane is a king that does better in a time of peace. Being self-aware is very important for a ruler, so that way he can know what to delegate. And this is something that he needs the very best to deal with.
Okay. I don't know if he's always someone who's very self-aware, per se, but I think that his decision to kind of divide the duties of kingship in pieces and dole out some responsibilities, like, all right, you deal with this, you deal with this, you deal with this, I'll deal with this, is the sign of a at least decent king.
He understands there's a state of emergency. He understands he has a duty to the people.
Nobody's ever dealt with this before. His father would have probably been out there fighting the good fight himself.
But he is not his father.
Yeah. On the other hand, Lane deals with the situation in a very rational, level-headed manner. Contrary to the film. In the film, he's very irrational. But looking at the wiki and looking at he handles things very rational, as said. No, I need Lothar. He's the most experienced guy with these things. You're in command. Save my people. What people you can. Fight the good fight. I'm going to get us some assistance, and I'm going to start to prep the armies for mobilization. You got to bear in mind, this kingdom would have a medieval set of armies. It takes time to mobilize them. But in the meantime, he needs to thwart the enemy. That's where the Fabian tactics come in. Resorting to burning the crops, taking what crops you need, and trying to starve the enemy out and using hit-and-run tactics. This is Anduin Lothar and Lane trying to buy time. And also cripple the enemy. And it's a valuable tactic. I mean, it worked for the trolls. They completely won. It's the kind of smart move that I think the Romans would have done. That's some of the highest praise I can heap on someone. Lane, and even arguably Anduin Lothar, lacked that genius Baratheon had. King Baratheon was just simply like the Scipio Africanus or Julius Caesar. He had a genius about him. So this is a kingdom that does not have its best leader on hand to save them. What it has are the second-hand leaders. But these second-hand leaders are not second-rate. They are reacting to the problem going, okay, we are not Baratheon, as you said, Dan. Try to deal with the problem as best we possibly could. And the best solution is to get people out of there and to hit, run, and slowly chip away at the enemy and try to figure out better strategy in the meantime. And on the other hand, wait for the entire army to be mobilized. This is a medieval army. This is not the Roman army. It takes time to mobilize, to train, to arm, to prepare. And so this is the very best idea as to the dispatching of messengers begging for help. On the one hand, what Lordaeron does, for example, saying, good luck, as, traitors. On the other hand, one has to bear in mind, Stormwind's problems are not Lordaeron's problems. The Elvish Kingdom's problems are not Stormwind's problems. Stormwind is wanting to call upon them to fight Stormwind's battles. They have no obligation to do so. Now, I know people want to look at it as, well, it's the fate of the world. But on the other hand, there's also nations involved. And nations only have interest. That's the thing. Stormwind and Lordaeron do have deep connections. In some ways, Stormwind is a colony of Lordaeron from a religious point of view, through the institutions of the Northshire Abbey and other abbeys. But the problem is, what Lane is asking for is direct military intervention. And Lordaeron might not be in a position to do that. And Lordaeron does not fully realize the scope of the threat and are kind of looking at the situation as, we're getting conflicting reports because Deathwing took up a disguise. According to the World of Warcraft Chronicle Volume 2, page 124, Stormwind had taken a great deal of pride in standing alone and developing a policy of isolationism, had begun to behave in such a way that the other nations saw them as arrogant. And this sort of policy coincides with Lane's rule. He wasn't exactly really pursuing the most friendly ties with them. And one can also look at his marriage to Anduin Lothar's sister as being a really, really dumb political act, because he married essentially a lesser nobleman's sister out of friendship with Anduin Lothar. It was not love for her, it was friendship with Anduin Lothar, in place of probably marriage alliances with the likes of, say, Lordaeron.
Which is probably what he should have gone.
And so he had made one political blunder after another in that regard, diplomatically. So inadvertently isolated Stormwind. Not saying Lane was to blame for everything. Some of the blame lies with him. It's certainly not Anduin Lothar's fault. Anduin Lothar was just doing his job. He didn't ask Lane to marry his sister. Stormwind is pursuing a policy of isolationism. Stormwind's king is not pursuing closer ties with Lordaeron. For this reason, Lordaeron has nothing to gain by throwing away their armies for Stormwind's sake. They are allies, not vassals. So therefore, they have no obligation to Stormwind. The trouble is that the isolationist policy came back to bite Stormwind in the rear, all because Stormwind took the action of developing a more isolationist policy. You have diplomatic mistakes that were made, you have the other nations that were just not interested, and you have Lane who's kind of screwed. Not put too fancy a bow on it, but he is screwed. As to the Frostwolves, they're positioning themselves in the Alterac Valley, trying to figure out a way to get out from under Gul'dan's thumb. As to the birth of Thrall, this is a very important event in the history of Azeroth. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Doomhammer taking out Blackhand.